Manjeet Krupalani, and I'm the Executive Director of Gateway House, the Indian Council on Global Relations. We're based in Mumbai. Welcome to the Gateway House and Geopolitical Cartographer webinar on From Crisis to Recovery, Takeaways from Sri Lanka. The timing could not have been more appropriate given the current conditions both domestically, regionally, and geopolitically. Sri Lanka is an important neighbor for India and serves a critical role as a port center in the Indian Ocean. We have an exciting hour ahead of us. I now request Vishan De Silva, Executive Director of Geopolitical Cartographer, to give the opening remarks. Vishan?
Thank you, Manjeet. It's my pleasure to be here and to connect with you and the Gateway House again. Good evening and a warm welcome to you all from Colombo, wherever you may be joining us. My name is Vishan De Silva and I'm the Executive Director of the Geopolitical Cartographer. Thank you to all of you who have joined this webinar titled From Crisis Towards Recovery, Takeaways from Sri Lanka between the Geopolitical Cartographer and the Gateway House of India. The Geopolitical Cartographer, as we know it internally as GC, is a relatively new research foundation formed by and under the patronage of the Honorable Ranil Wickremesinghe, who is currently serving his 6th term as Prime Minister of the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka. The GC was incorporated a little over a year ago in Sri Lanka and focuses on the geopolitics, international economics, and maritime affairs of the Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean, and the connected landmass, which are redrawing the global political order. The GC is a non-profit making and non-partisan think tank and a regional public policy research foundation. It operates from Sri Lanka with a distinct external focus and outreach. The focus of the research foundation is the Indian Ocean and its littoral states, including its emergence as an epicenter in the remaking of the global political order, the creation of a single strategic maritime space resulting from the interconnection with the Pacific Ocean, and other global developments having an impact on the mission of the foundation, such as we are discussing today. Unfortunately, Dr. R. Samaratunga, the former Secretary of the Treasury of Sri Lanka and also a member of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the GC, has been unwell and will not be able to present his piece today. We will circulate some of the relevant slides that Dr. Samaratunga would have used that highlight the background and sources of the economic crisis, and hopefully Dr. Samaratunga will be able to join to make a comment during the Q&A session. I would like to thank all of our guests for joining us today, especially our esteemed panelists, Mr. Amit Bhandari, Senior Fellow, Connectivity, Investments and Energy from the Gateway House, Mrs. Chitrangani Wagiswara, the former Foreign Secretary of Sri Lanka and also a member of the SAC of GC, and Dr. Ganeshan Wignaraja, Senior Fellow of the National University of Singapore and also a member of the SAC of the GC. I'd also like to thank our moderator for today's session, former Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia, Distinguished Fellow, Gateway House, as well as all the other helpers from the Gateway House, including Ali and Saeed. With that, I would like to hand the floor over to Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia to begin the session today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manjeet and Rishan, for setting the tone for this panel discussion. It's a privilege and pleasure for me to take part in this panel discussion. I think this is the beginning of a good collaboration between two institutions which are beginning to know each other very well. I'm impressed by the name of the Sri Lankan institution, Geopolitical Cartographer. And of course, as you know, Gateway House comes from the very heart of Mumbai. Obviously, therefore, we can look into the basic issues today rather closely, the situation in Sri Lanka and the takeaways from it. The basic issue that we are trying to first unravel here, as I can see, is the nature of the crisis here in Sri Lanka. I think we need economists, political scientists, diplomats, and also experts in geopolitics to decipher what has been going on and what exactly led to the present situation that has been drawing the serious attention of the media and policymakers. As was mentioned earlier, clearly Sri Lanka is a very important country in South Asia and in the Indian Ocean region. Therefore, what happens there is of interest to the entire region, and therefore there would be a very important angle to look at whether Sri Lanka is content with the responses that it has received from the region in terms of help. Now, in that context, I cannot help pointing out, looking at the diplomatic dimensions, that one country which was very active in Sri Lankan affairs in the recent years has become a bit of an absentee partner these days. So that would be definitely an interesting angle to explore in a objective research-based manner. We are not here doing any politicking. On the other hand, it is a matter of satisfaction and pride for us in India that the government of India has been proactive, a kind of a first responder. And I took note that our friend Vinay Mohan Kawatra, Foreign Secretary, very recently led a high-level team which included the Finance Secretary to the Government of India and the Chief Economic Advisor. And it was wonderful to see the photograph of these three gentlemen sitting with His Excellency the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka and obviously their own counterparts as well, to look as to what really are the next steps that have to be taken. So I only want to say that as already known now, we would be first having an opportunity, each panelist, to speak for about 5 minutes to present their opening remarks. And once the round is over, then I would be putting a question or two to each of them, and thereafter we shall open it to the audience. And since we started about 7 or 8 minutes late, we will still, I think, give 1 full hour for the event. So with this, it is now my great pleasure to invite Dr. Ganesh Vignaraja, Senior Fellow at the National University of Singapore, who is actually now in Colombo, and so we look forward to hearing him. Dr. Ganeshan.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bhatia, and it's a real pleasure to be at Gateway House. Let me just jump straight in. I'll talk a bit about the crisis from the economics point of view, and I'll try to keep it as brief as I can. I'll give you a very brief sense of the numbers, some story about the explanations, and I want to spend a bit of time on the agenda and China's dilemma before going on to some lessons from Sri Lanka for the other countries that are indebted. Thank you. So in terms of the numbers, as you may all remember, Sri Lanka defaulted on its foreign debt in April 2022, and there was a big rise in debt requirement against very low usable reserves. And contrary to a lot of popular opinion, China accounts for some 10% of our total debt today, rather than 50%, and 50% is owed to capital markets or private creditors. We have seen, a collapse of the economy, as the Prime Minister said, very high inflation. So people talk about this as stagflation, and we've had a big rise in poverty. And Ranil Wickremesinghe assumed power as Prime Minister on the 12th of May, 2022, when the Rajapaksa brothers made a change in the way that they were doing business. Explaining this crisis, I like to think of it in 2 dimensions. One is that we had external events impinging upon our destiny, and the Russia-Ukraine war has been a big factor in this, with rising fuel and food prices. But we also had the economic hit coming from COVID, which has been quite a significant effect, where the economy contracted by 3.6% in 2020. And then we've had these policy missteps by the Mahinda Rajapaksa, Gotabaya Rajapaksa government. They had comprehensive tax cuts, which absorbed which equivalent to some 2% of GDP of Sri Lanka. They overnight banned chemical fertilizers and went to organic fertilizers. They maintained expansionary monetary policy beyond their shelf life, and a whole host of other things. And most importantly, they appointed the wrong officials in the key jobs, including a central bank governor who should really be an independent person, who turned out to be a politician and said no IMF. And then all of this happened on a weak economy. So that's the basic story, and we can come back to that. Now, where do we go from here? There are four things that have to happen. The first is we have to restructure the debt with private and bilateral creditors, and a law firm and a debt advisor have been appointed, and that process may take some time. Second, there's an IMF team in town still. I think they leave tomorrow. I was in a session with them yesterday with a few think tanks, and they're talking about a revenue-based consolidation program for Sri Lanka, where we hope to get some 3.4 billion plus money for Sri Lanka to help to stabilize the economy and to allow us to borrow again from the international capital market, which is going to be needed. One of the things that the IMF program also have underlined is that they will not cut expenditure such that the safety nets for the poor can be maintained, and they will look to the World Bank to try to provide some money for cash transfers to the poor. Because without this, we will have much hardship on the poor, and we already have significant public protest, and the bottom will fall out of society and the economy if we're not careful. And there's this horrible phenomenon that's happening of, massive poverty and this very unpalatable phenomenon of child malnutrition, stunting as poor families are down to 1 meal a day. It is really, really horrible and very distressing for all of us who are here. Now, austerity alone and supporting the poor is not enough. We're going to have to do medium to long-term reforms to change the way the Sri Lankan economy looks. We are going to have to go from a state-dominated system to a much more market-based, greener economy, which is leaner and able to compete on the basis of its competitive advantage in services, with some manufacturing and some emphasis on agriculture. The problem in Sri Lanka at the moment is there is no political consensus for this agenda. We have a kind of a multi-party government, but it's very much SLPP led. And we have the opposition who are talking about something else, but we're not quite sure what they're saying. There needs to be a very strong public communication strategy for also the reforms which are needed in this process. And the people have to be taken along with it, because adjustment will be quite demanding on the population. And we need to create this long-term vision for where we want to go as a country and a society once we resume on a growth path. And we'll have to have a lot of strong implementation and monitoring of this agenda. The IMF program, essentially, I've spoken already about. And essentially, for 18 months or so, the previous Mahinda Rajapaksa, Gotabaya Rajapaksa government said there was no need for a IMF program, instead of which they subscribed to what's called homegrown solutions, which proved to be a disaster and led us to debt amongst the international shocks coming from the Russia-Ukraine war. But there was a U-turn in policy in March, when the president announced we were going to the fund, and then we had engagement with the fund, and they're currently here. But it will take some time, and this is the fly in the ointment for Sri Lanka. To get an IMF program, we have to show debt sustainability. And that will take some time, because we have private creditors who are lawyering up, and there are significant players in the market, such as BlackRock and others, which are very powerful, and Sri Lanka has never had such a situation before. Likewise, there's China, who are being very quiet, as you alluded to in your opening remarks, on providing us with debt moratoria, which we are urgently going to need. So the economy outlook could worsen in 2022. Already the Department of Census and Statistics have said growth in the first quarter of 2022 was minus 1.6%. Forecasts that I have seen can range from minus 3% for this year, which was the number that we kind of had during COVID 2020, but a much worse number of minus 6%. And then there is this real risk going forward that if we delay in implementing this IMF and structural reform agenda, and we mishandle this economy going forward because of bickering amongst the political parties as they jockey for the next set of elections, the economy could be hurt for years to come. And I'm quite worried about this. Let me lastly just mention the structural reforms, and there's a whole bunch of things that have to be done, and I'm happy to talk about that in the chat. This slide is too small to see. I just want to talk about China, which is the elephant in the room. China was very ready to give us commercial loans for infrastructure projects, sparking claims that China is stuck in a debt trap, put Sri Lanka into a Chinese debt trap. And this narrative is there also from CPD in India as well as other institutions. When you look at the evidence, you see that there's good and bad projects on the ground. So kind of a really bad project would be something like, the bird's nest in Colombo, this cultural center that they built, which is not much used. There is the Lotus Tower that hangs over Colombo city, and Chitrangani, I'm sure, can see it from a window. Then there are these good projects in inverted commas, such as the CICT terminal in Colombo port, which has been a major region for Sri Lanka being able to export and act as a transshipment hub for India. So there are good and bad projects. They're not all bad. But we asked, China sort of about debt forgiveness, and we owe something like 9% of equivalent of our GDP to China as of now. That's $7.6 billion as of now. That's the estimate I make. So the debt problem is not wholly made in China, it's made in capital markets. China has faced this dilemma. On the one hand, it wants to be a friend to Sri Lanka and not lose commercial opportunities, particularly 6% loans are involved, which it has had in Hambantota among some of the loans. But it worries that if it gives Sri Lanka unilateral moratoria on debt or debt forgiveness, this will mean there is a queue of people coming to China saying that, we have the debt distress problems and we want that. And China also makes this excuse that it is having a slowdown and a rise in cases, and it's much more preoccupied with things at home. There are many lessons from the Sri Lankan case. There is a piece which I won't go into. The most important lesson for me is this issue about macroprudential. Basically, it means a strong independent central bank. And the central bank is at the core of our system in Sri Lanka. And sadly, it failed from the top level because the governor, said there was no crisis, that we had plenty of money, and instead of which he sold all the foreign exchange to defend the currency and including the gold, and he let us down very, very badly. So I think a strong independent central bank is necessary with an independently focused monetary board. So the management of the central bank includes the governor plus a couple of other independents. I think the monetary board in future should have 3 or 4 independents, and they should have a very strong voice in the management of the central bank. The governor himself or herself should be appointed by the president perhaps, but with a constitutional council with no politicians. So I've decided to be very radical in what I'm suggesting. And some of this I hope will get reflected in the new Banking Law Act, which is under the purview at the moment of Central Bank and Parliament, and also a new Central Bank Act. And we should be very honest in our communication. So let me just stop there by saying Sri Lanka is in a very painful storyline at the moment, and there are no quick fixes to this crisis. But I sincerely believe that with the right policies and political will, we can come out by leveraging our geography and skill base. Remember, Sri Lanka's debt problem is peanuts. I mean, it's only 5-6 billion this year. This is something that can easily be sorted out. And then the fundamentals are quite good. Bridging finance from friendly countries and debt forgiveness, I think, is terribly important. And other countries have to learn the lessons from Sri Lanka so we don't repeat this. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I've taken too long.
Thank you very much for an excellent opening presentation. I think you have made the task of other panelists much easier. We shall have a chance to pose questions to you. Now let me request Amit Bhandari, who is a Senior Fellow at Gateway House, specializing in economic, energy and other related sectors. He has been watching Sri Lanka very closely. Amit, 5 minutes, please.
Yeah, thank you, Rajiv. Thank you, Manjeet, also for sharing a link to a report that Gateway House had published in 2018, looking at significant Chinese investments in South Asian region. And back in 2018, we had pointed out certain issues about debt sustainability for Sri Lanka and Pakistan, specifically in the South Asian region. Now, before we jump into solutions, I would probably want to spend some time on what the problem is, and which is of course caused by reckless borrowing. And this is a common strand which can be seen in defaults of Sri Lanka, Lebanon, Greece, or Argentina. And specific problems of Sri Lanka are also evident in some other countries of the region at a milder scale. Pakistan right now is in the process of negotiations with IMF for I think yet another bailout package. Maldives has faced a problem too. And in the slightly extended neighborhood, Laos and Kenya are facing similar issues. Now, one common factor in all of these seems to be China, which has also played a role by handing out cash for unsustainable projects at high interest rates. We are not commenting on the intent behind the loans. We are merely pointing the outcome that they have led to, which is clearly not something anybody desired. The other issue, of course, is the weak governance in the host countries, which allowed this kind of a situation to arise, letting this unsustainable debt pile up. Now, I will take the example of Pakistan, where we have seen power projects built way beyond what the local economy needs, which is overcapacity that has been created. In Sri Lanka, we see that in Hambantota port and the airport which has been built nearby. At a very high cost, the projects have been built at a much higher cost, and the interest rates on these loans are also substantially more than what a World Bank or ADB would have given for infrastructure. In Pakistan's case, we have seen loans at LIBOR plus 4%. In Sri Lanka's case, I think some loans in 2014-15 were made at LIBOR plus 3.5%, which for that time was a high interest rate. So this is a larger problem which Sri Lanka now and a number of other countries will have to deal with. Unfortunately, in this case, Sri Lanka has served as the proverbial canary in the coal mine. Now, for any way out of the current problems, the debt has to be restructured, as Dr. Vignaraja pointed out, and especially the high interest loans. And unless these problem loans are renegotiated, other lenders will also be reluctant to waive off dues. Now, my view is very strongly that lenders who have been irresponsible also need to take a haircut. This is something which I think Argentina sort of enforced in their last default. And this can also serve as a template for other borrowers in the future. I'm specifically thinking of Pakistan, Laos, and Kenya, which are in a similar issue. The other thing I would like to deal with is the governance from the borrower side, which led to this kind of a situation. Now, we cannot look into the future and say that 15 or 20 years down the line, a similar concentration of political power will not lead to a similar outcome again. So some safeguards have to be built on public spending. Large projects should either be done by the private sector, and this is something which India is increasingly following for ports, airports, power projects as well. If the government has to get into infrastructure, the funding has to come from multilaterals such as ADB or the World Bank. Now, both of these institutions are a pain to deal with. They impose multiple conditions, but they also ensure that the project is transparent, bribery or corruption is minimal, the project is sustainable, and finally, the interest rates are much lower. So I think ADB or World Bank, whenever they are lending to a sovereign government for infrastructure, the rates are, I think, LIBOR plus 0.25. Now, the other part is, of course, corruption. I saw a report in one of the Sri Lankan newspapers today saying that a large part of some of the unsustainable projects may have been, maybe up to 20%, may have been paid as commissions. Now, if projects are executed without transparency, without competitive bidding, this kind of an outcome can be expected. I mean, this is an expected outcome. So mega projects which can push a country under debt have to be scrutinized more closely. And if the World Bank thinks that a project is unviable, perhaps it should not be done with public money at all. Now, India has had its own experience of going to the IMF in 1992, when we were hit by the first Persian Gulf War, high oil prices, and a fall in inward remittances. And it was a traumatic time. We had to pledge gold to pay for imports. But our economic reforms could be undertaken only because there was a crisis. And I think in Sri Lanka's case, the current crisis could be a chance to push through similar measures, which ensure that this is the country's last trip to the IMF and such a situation does not recur. Thank you, Rajiv. That's all from my side.
Thank you, Amit. As always, very precise, but also very clear. And you have a perspective which is not based on any ideological angle, so I'm sure it will also attract some discussion and debate at this stage. We are honored to have with us Mrs. Chitrangani, a former Foreign Secretary in Sri Lanka, and we look forward now to hear your presentation, Madam. Please go ahead. 5 minutes or so. You are mute. You are mute.
Thank you
Yes.
very much. You can hear me well, right?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Yeah. And as I have only 5 minutes, I'll go very quickly. And I will not deal with the crisis from the economics point of view, because I think Dr. Ganesh and also Dr. Samaratunga's slides, which has been circulated, as well as Amit Bandari has gone through. So what I will focus is on the topic today, on the takeaways for Sri Lanka and of course India, Sri Lanka, because that is my area which I think I've been asked to speak on, although I was not due to speak in the early panel, but thank you for the opportunity. So let me focus on the role that India has been playing and continues to play. I think India has already granted about US dollars 3.5 billion rupees during this crisis last few weeks or months, which I think all of us, all citizens, are very grateful, especially on the energy sector, which is a very critical area for, and also of course the other areas, food and medicine. It is also heartening to note that the southern state of Tamil Nadu has also sent about 2 shipments to Sri Lanka, food and medicine, which we do appreciate, and I think we should take note of. What India has done and how India is standing by us demonstrates, I think, your Prime Minister's neighborhood first policy in action, which is really in solidarity with Sri Lanka. The crisis situation we know, and also all this help that is coming in, as I said, I'm speaking about India, cannot continue and will not continue, and we shouldn't, Sri Lanka should not expect this aid to continue, and we have to look at what needs to be done to have economic stability and of course political stability. So what I wish to state very briefly is what we expect from India, and of course India-Sri Lanka relations on the economic side, and what takeaways for India. I think 3 areas which I can identify. Of course there are many areas, but 3 areas would be investment, trade and tourism. On the investment side, of course, as fuel and energy is one of the priorities, we know that IOC, Indian Oil Corporation, is already in Sri Lanka, and there could be many more agreements or sort of discussions, negotiations on how well this IOC could also handle this issue of energy. And Sri Lanka has announced that we will open up the energy sector for the private sector for procurement and refinery, etc. And that is yet to be seen, but I think that's a positive step, and India could also look at opportunities. Then on the alternative energy side, solar and wind energy are areas where India also has a lot of expertise, and that's another area. In the long term, of course, oil exploration. We have done some tests, and there is some evidence that there may be oil in the offshore oil in the western shore of Sri Lanka, and that's a long-term issue. Then on the pharmaceuticals, digital infrastructure, other areas where India could look at, because as I said, we have to now start looking at areas on the economic front, how we could work with India and of course with the rest of the world and other countries that are prepared to partner with Sri Lanka. On the FTA with Sri Lanka, which is now about, I think, about 20 years since we first started operating the FTA, there are certain areas that needs to be discussed to promote more trade between the 2 countries. And I know there were certain issues, and we had, I think, quite a few rounds of talks when I was there, 2017, 2018, on the quotas, issue of quotas, quality standards, procedural delays, bureaucratic delays, and also more market access. And that's an area that India India could look at in the long term under the FTA to provide more market access to Sri Lanka. Then, of course, other areas are connectivity. I saw another article in the papers today saying that we want to have maybe cargo transportation opened up between Kankasanture, that is in the north of Sri Lanka, and South India. So that's also another good area. Then tourism, of course, we know that India was sending the highest number of tourists to Sri Lanka. Of course, with the present crisis, there are certain issues and there may be some apprehensions as well. But we know that the tourist board is working on having a plan to have more concessions and privileges, special privileges for the tourists who may visit. Then turning to the political field, because we cannot separate economics with political. Of course, you spoke about the China factor. It is India, it has been said, there are apprehensions being expressed that this move, India's aid is a move to counter China's presence in Sri Lanka, but we don't think so, because for us, for Sri Lanka, we will work with India and with China and any other country that will help Sri Lanka, especially in this critical juncture. And then on India, we know that India's foreign policy, strategic autonomy is very important, and that could be seen these days with India expressing, especially the foreign affairs, external affairs minister Jaishankar expressing many views on the Russia-Ukraine issue, very independent, we're taking an independent stand. And that shows that India is emerging as a regional power. And that would also have ramifications with the Indo-Pacific issues and on the crisis. And also, we are thankful to the finance minister, Mrs. Sitaraman, who we are with the IMF, and I know she has spoken in support of Sri Lanka at the IMF talks, and that is also something which India could continue to support. And Sri Lanka has been also talking about a credit aid conference to be convened with India, China, and Japan, and maybe some other countries as well, which would help Sri Lanka to get over this very, very critical juncture in Sri Lanka. While speaking to the IMF, we need the assistance, support, and solidarity of many countries as possible. So to conclude, I wish to say that, as I said, we need the assistance, the understanding, and the goodwill to stabilize our economy. And I'm sure we could get over this crisis, but it might take a little time. And also, it has been said that a crisis creates opportunities. And who knows, this may be a turning point in new thinking. Thank you.
Thank you very much for very insightful remarks, and we are grateful that you focused on the India dimension of this entire story. Dear friends, this is the time when, while waiting for questions from the audience, I would like to put some specific questions to the panelists, at least one or two rounds, and then if meanwhile have somebody question, welcome to raise the hand or send in the chat box, and we'll find a way to come to your question. Let me follow the same order and go to Dr. Ganeshan first. You of course made a very balanced and very calibrated presentation on the genesis of the crisis, the way it unfolded, the impact, and then the way out. It sounds a very balanced view. Let me, however, focus on the political dimensions, and perhaps we can be a little more candid, since this is the think tank situation here. The perception in India is that the present Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe has been doing an excellent job. He is doing a brave, courageous job, and yet he does not really have a political base of his own. Those who had the political base and who received overwhelming support from the people of Sri Lanka, not once but twice, first for the presidential election and then for the parliamentary elections, ended up perhaps being blamed for misgovernance. You yourself have raised and referred to this again and again. So my question is really, when there is a fatal mix of populism, a bit of authoritarianism, and also perhaps a considerable amount of political corruption, does that create a very fertile climate for the kind of economic challenges the country is facing today? Dr. Ganesan.
No, thank you. It's a very pertinent question, I think, because when we really look at what has happened here in the past, it is really quite horrifying. That you can take a country that is at the cusp of upper middle income and then collapse it down where our per capita income is falling, right? And in Gotabaya Rajapaksa's vistas of prosperity and splendor, he talked about $6,500 by 2025. I think we'll be lucky to keep our per capita income at $3,000 per head if we don't manage our economy right. And there is a serious risk of further backsliding if the reforms aren't done. So I think really three things have to happen, Ambassador Bhatia. The first is we've got to implement both an IMF program and a 5-year program, not a 3-year program. And that was one of the points I made to the IMF team last night as I was asked to speak with them. And a second, and the reason I asked for 5 years is that we need some time for adjustment. And I sort of suggested to them that they should go gradually on Sri Lanka. Otherwise, the political will may not be there to implement the multitude of reforms they want to have. The second very important thing is we've got to have structural reforms. And I think that really means getting government out of a lot of areas in Sri Lanka, sadly, because, we have too much government, sadly. We have state-owned enterprises, for instance, the fuel sector. And today, government ended the duopoly, I think. Is that right? I think Chitrangani can answer to that. I think they entered the duopoly today, which I think was quite significant, allowing anyone to import fuel. But we're going to have to really deal with all these state-owned enterprises. And that's very, very important. It's very difficult and very messy because the unions are very strong. The third thing we've got to do, Ambassador Bhatia, is to have very strong anti-corruption measures right through. We have to have, a strong sense of, corruption and parliamentary scrutiny. Wrongdoers have to be punished. And the problem comes if we accept the theory that the family were very corrupt, which is what's being put out there now. And some ridiculous numbers are thrown about the extent of corruption, which I don't quite subscribe to, but certainly there seems to have been evidence of rent-seeking behavior at different points. We then have to say, look, we also have to have some sort of recovery of these types of assets. So I think these are the hard issues we're going to have to tackle if we want this country to prosper. And I think there's a hard choice that people have to face, right? Do we want to be, and I'll put it out there, a failed state model, which is something that Pakistan emulates, in my view, or do we want to be a prosperous country that is like a Hong Kong on China, in the case of India? And that's a really hard choice at the next election. So there are no easy answers, Ambassador, but I think these are the hard choices we're going to face. Chitrangani may want to also respond. I don't mean to put you in the hot seat, Chitrangani, but...
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think you have been quite forthright, and all that I want to share with you is that, here we in India do not really hold very strong views when it comes to the internal political configurations. But as a student of politics over a long period, it does, I can dare say, seem very glaring when 7 or 8 members of a family enter the cabinet. This was quite unprecedented, I think, in our part of the world. And when that happens, and when that gets accepted by the people, then pain perhaps becomes inevitable in some form or the other. Let me turn to Amit and ask a question about the economic side of the crisis. You have heard Dr. Ganesan explaining his diagnosis. the genesis, the recent developments, his suggestions for the way out. So first of all, do you agree with him, or do you feel that there is some other way, or a kind of a mixed way to try to get out of this crisis? And there is a second related question which concerns China. While you have emphasized even today in your intervention how China wrongly connected to Sri Lanka and how therefore China must take certain steps, generally there is a broader view that this is not a crisis created by China, but it certainly has been contributed to by China if we look at the background of this entire episode. I wrote somewhere saying that Hambantota has become a metaphor of how a big state should not connect with a small state. So could you, Amit, please respond to both the issues here?
So Rajiv, one, that China is not solely to blame. That was not the intent. But it was a significant contributor is something I would like to highlight. So we recently went through budgetary documents which were given out by Pakistani government, their latest union budget. So they have debts which come under 2 or 3 heads. One head is bilateral loans which are directly coming from China. The second was commercial bank loans, some of which were Chinese, some of which were not Chinese, some of which were Western. But Chinese banks were almost entirely owned by the state. So I do not know whether it is a good idea to keep the commercial lending in a separate basket if it is coming from a state-owned enterprise. And there was yet another head, I think China's state-owned foreign exchange manager who had put some money again in Pakistan. Now the other comparison we did was on interest rates. So China owes roughly the same amounts to World Bank and to Chinese bilateral loans, but the interest payouts on the Chinese loans were I think 4 or 5x of what it was for the World Bank. So I mean, it is not just the absolute amount of loans, but also the interest rate which matters. And when we were working on our study in 2018, we had a very hard time finding clear information on the terms and conditions on which loans were made. Whenever we do not see transparency, usually the tendency is to suspect that there is something fishy which is going on. Hambantota Port again is something which we followed for several months some time back, and we found that it was getting grand total of I think 1 vessel every week, I think, or one vessel every week. So for a port of that size, this was clearly a overkill, if I can use the term. So that is one part. I think there has been a contributory role which has been played. Probably not enough thought went into creation of projects, creation of proper viable projects, and probably a World Bank driven project would have been a much better option for the country than, in case of China, there is an issue that there is a leader, the leader has a vision, and everyone is trying to execute that vision the best they see fit. And a lot of things get the short shrift in those kind of circumstances. I'm referring, of course, to the Belt and Road project. So I would suggest that a multilateral route will be better for Sri Lanka. The other part is I would again like to touch upon an issue raised by Dr. Vignaraja, that we will probably have to live with a certain amount of corruption, and the point that you raised of family politics happening in our part of the world, that is something which will probably not change. What we can try and introduce is certain safeguards which ensure that you cannot create trouble beyond a certain point. That any project which is so having a large project mandatorily funded by a multilateral can be one such step. In India, we had a similar experience in the 1990s with the Dabhol Power project, completely non-transparent, and I mean the hidden terms and conditions were appalling. Luckily for us, Enron went bankrupt and it could not enforce those conditions in India, but it was a very bad project. We haven't seen a recurrence of that. So that is an experience again which Sri Lanka and other countries of the region will also have to learn from. How to not have a Dabhol Part 2 or Hambantota Part 2, if I can use the term.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Amit. You have been very clear. Madam Chitrangani, I have a question for you. in Sri Lanka today, in this context of the political and economic crisis, there are other players, other external players than India and China. So there is Japan. We have been hearing that Sri Lanka-Japan relations have been stressed, and as a result, Japan is not coming forward fully to assist Sri Lanka. Then, of course, there is US, the traditional partner for Sri Lanka of long standing, the US and UK and a few other Western countries. So my question to you is, how, in your judgment, these other external partners are performing to help Sri Lanka resolve what has been touted as the single gravest economic crisis since independence?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, of course, you're looking at the present status of what's going on and what is happening in Sri Lanka, and of course, countries that are engaging with Sri Lanka. Well, about the countries that you mentioned, and of course, many more others, EU, the ASEAN, because we follow an non-aligned policy and we are friends with all the countries. What is happening is, I think, of course, I think US has promised or pledged some sort of some millions, not a very big amount in present terms, also to help Sri Lanka at this juncture. What the feeling is that these countries are sort of still assessing as to what is going on, what is happening, and what happened. Of course, Dr. Raja spoke about the wrong decisions, mistakes that have been made, corruption, all those issues. So I think what they are waiting for, or what they are watching, is mainly political stability. It is an economic problem, but there has to be political stability. And questions are being asked about, of course, now there is a big cry for the president to resign. Then the prime minister was appointed, and there is a new cabinet of ministers. The people still, to be very frank, people may have questions about the new cabinet. Some of some of the ministers who have corruption charges have not been appointed as cabinet ministers, but the political, because now the new prime minister was appointed 8 weeks ago. So they are watching the political stability, I think, really come forward. And even within the parliament, still the opposition, some of the parties are all divided, and within parties there are divisions. So we haven't, I think, to a certain extent, in parliament also got our act together. The opposition moved out the last week when some discussions were to take place. So I think the main fact that we need now is to convince the world that we are moving towards political stability. I think that is the main issue that is holding back some of the countries.
Thank you very much. Clearly, the conclusion from what you have said is that some of these partners are kind of bidding their time. And if I may share with you an insight which I receive from time to time by talking to the powers that be here in Delhi, I think while India is helping in terms of advancing the Sri Lankan cause, I think your diplomatic machine probably will have to work a bit harder on some of these other partners, because you remember when the Quad summit was taking place in Tokyo, there was a strong expectation that Quad partners will discuss the Sri Lanka situation and perhaps come out with a package of support. That did not happen. Of course, nobody expected that the issue would be discussed in G7 summit, which ended yesterday. But I think it's very important, given Sri Lanka's very significant role in the region and on the global stage, to keep that in mind. Let me turn to Dr. Ganeshan. I don't see any question, but I'm very happy to produce a few more questions. So Dr. Ganeshan, here I think I invite now your attention to India's role. You said yourself that the money needed to support Sri Lanka in the interim is peanuts, $6 billion. Now, what is the perception in Sri Lanka about India's role? Has India done enough? $3.5 billion, and we keep hearing more money probably will come in the pipeline. So not just the quantum, but what is the perception at the level of intelligentsia? Is India doing enough? Is India doing it with some expectations, if not some conditions? And is it that Sri Lanka is turning to India now because it has very few options, but later we can again go back to the traditional sense of insecurity that gets bred when we deal with a small and a big country in size? How do you look honestly and candidly India's role, and if you have any advice for India, because I'm sure this program will be listened to by the policy makers as well. If you have any advice, this is a good occasion to share it, sir.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bhatia. As always, a very sharp and pertinent question. Look, I think India coming in as a first responder to Sri Lanka, and I'm sure Chitrangani will agree with me, has been greatly appreciated by the population. India really was the country that came in, with food, with fuel, and also with cash. And I think that was very useful. And the cash came with the RBI swaps, if you remember, under the SARC arrangement, then there was a bilateral swap. So India has been there, and I think that is greatly appreciated now by Sri Lanka, and we realize that China can be a fair weather friend, and that is, turning clearly in my mind as something that I'm looking at very carefully. They are very happy to give us support when it's at 6%, but they're unhappy to give us support when Sri Lanka seems to be in this kind of trouble, in the sense that they have not given us debt moratoria or forgiveness. And I think that is the first thing we would expect. And they've given this in many African countries. And I'm, as a Sri Lankan, I'm very concerned about, the way in which this is playing out. But as far as India is concerned, I think people of Sri Lanka are broadly understanding. Now, there is one question, though, about the emergency aid, and I'll come to the broader question. What I would like to know better, again, as a Sri Lankan and without any affiliation, is what kind of monitoring India is putting in place for how that aid is being distributed, right, in Sri Lanka. And I would have thought, and I hope, that that aid is being very carefully monitored by the embassy, right? So there are very few leakages. It's getting to the needy and the poor through appropriate systems, perhaps through NGOs, which I think may be in some case as good as some government routes. So we avoid the politicians putting some of this in their pockets. And I have no evidence of any of this. I'm just saying that Indian aid should be very carefully monitored. We see the numbers very big, but I would really like it to go to the poor and all over Sri Lanka, not just, in certain bits of Sri Lanka. So that's the first point. So monitoring the aid that you give, I think, is very important with the food and things like that. That's one. And if there are instances of corruption, that should be immediately called out by India. There should be no, this is Indian taxpayer money. And we need to be very clear in Sri Lanka and also with India that this money is being used properly to alleviate the suffering of the Sri Lankan people. I think that is absolutely essential. The second bit, I think, and this I look as a development economist, right? So this 6 billion I talked about for this year, I think is very useful because we need about $500 million a month to keep Sri Lanka afloat in the sense of being able to do essential inputs. That's the back of the envelope number I've done. I'm not talking about any investment. I'm not talking about anything fancy. I'm talking about food, fuel, etc. $500 million a month with the export numbers we may generate and the few tourists who may come if we can get our act together, right? Now, that's not a big number for India. And I would like India to consider doing something very historic, which would really build up your ambition of you being on the Security Council, being part of the G20. India should really think big. The Sri Lanka problem is one city in India. What is this? One city that has been petulant, which has been badly governed, if I can say it, right? So for India, this is nothing. India to consider co-supporting an IMF program. And I think that would be a really historic step as far as I am concerned. And it's the kind of thing I think the Honorable Prime Minister of Sri Lanka should consider making that part of his proposal, rather than, just asking for bilateral. We should do it in a way that India looks really good at this. And it would really allow Indian soft power to be realized. And as I said, Sri Lanka is very doable if you do it in conjunction with the IMF, because the IMF has capability of supervision of something like this with India and the finance ministry. The third point I want to make is this is a very good opportunity to what Chitrangani was saying, is to really build this trade investment nexus, right? So Sri Lanka needs help today. And I see the relationship going from dependency, which is what we desperately need today, the people of Sri Lanka, not the governments, people, right? To an aid-trade relationship, which can be a win-win. Having seen the Hong Kong-China model, right? Having seen the South Africa model with its neighbors, having seen these larger configurations even in Latin America, Brazil and its neighbors, Sri Lanka, India is a natural configuration because of the geography, right? Now, what that means in my view, and I'm not necessarily asking my colleagues to agree with me, I think the development has to come through the South Indian states, as Prime Minister Ranil has talked about, along with the linkages with Sri Lanka. And this is pure geography. And that would have to come through the north. It would mean we have to build the idea of the ferry service and the shipping lines connecting with the north and with South India. The airport has to function properly. Tourists have to be welcomed. And then we have to look at this whole Trincomalee project again. So I think looking at it in that way, the infrastructure can be built, and then the trade agreement would then add the rules-based working of this. And I remember even talking to the port city people in Colombo and them saying, look, this cannot work if it's predicated upon Chinese and East Asian investment. Indian investors from, say, Gurgaon or Mumbai, where you all are based, may come and consider putting money in the services sector, in a prosperous Sri Lanka. I'm not saying coming and putting money in a bankrupt Sri Lanka, but in prosperous. And this would be very useful. After all, Indian investment went to Mauritius, which was far further out, if you remember, and fueled the financial center there. So I think the India-Sri Lanka relationship can be reset in a very positivist manner. And it can also be supportive of Indian leadership globally and really showing that Indian soft power can work. One last point, an understated thing in Indian aid that I have always thought was very important was this ambulance service you built in Sri Lanka, which was a marvelous example of a project. We have these public health system in Sri Lanka through some 1,000-odd plus hospitals. And we had a problem because we couldn't get people to the hospitals. And India came with this $20 million project, right? That was all it was, with 400 plus Tata ambulances, and just changed the game, right, in which that can work. And there's a wonderful example. Indians don't talk about this enough, to be honest with you. So I think Indians should be much prouder about their aid. The first Rush founder story in Sri Lanka,
thank you,
etc.
Thank
Plus, going from aid dependence to trade and investment. And I think the Sri Lankans also, and I will do this in my own way, and I'm sure Changni will, to talk about this natural geography we should explore.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ganesan. I appreciate very much. A very quick last two questions. We are at 6:04, so we should be handing it over back to Manjeet in next 3-4 minutes. Amit, I think there was reference to 1991. P.V. Narasimha Rao and his finance minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, pulled India out of the gravest economic crisis back in 1991. I have a great respect and regard for the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, Ranil Wickremesinghe. I dealt with him and interacted with him 30 years back when I was handling India-Sri Lanka relations. In terms of your knowledge and understanding of history, do you feel that Ranil can be the P.V. Narasimha Rao of Sri Lanka today? And while you are answering that, please also answer Dr. Ganesan, how at a time when we are discussing Sri Lankan economy being in ICU, how do we encourage and motivate Indian investors to step up their presence in Sri Lanka?
Okay, Rajiv, I think I get the tough questions always. Okay, so I will let me take up the second part on potential areas of collaboration. Now, one common strand that we saw in many of the South Asian countries, problematic projects, was essentially power sector projects. Now India gets most of its electricity from coal produced locally, which is very cheap. So our power sector is a mess, but it is a domestic mess. Unfortunately, a Sri Lanka or a Pakistan cannot get a World Bank loan for a thermal power plant, a coal-based power plant like India has. So one short-term solution, and I think this project has been on the on sort of the planning board for over a decade now, would be to connect Sri Lankan grid with the Indian grid as well. That provides Sri Lanka access to cheap power, cheap and reliable power from the Indian grid, from NTPC. And I think if you see from the Indian side of the Tamil Nadu coast actually is home to about 8 or 9,000 megawatts of wind farms. So I think Sri Lankan side also has substantial potential for renewable energy, and renewable energy could be one major export from Sri Lanka to India. This is something which can be done in a sort of isolation from rest of the economy. It is something which can be done in a relatively short frame of time. Renewable energy projects are fairly quick to be to executed. So I think this could present one area for collaboration. The other part is that, I mean, and this pains me to say this, but India has, to its credit, a number of missteps on issues like taxation and treatment of investors. And Dr. Vignaraja pointed out about the role Mauritius has played in India, FDI coming into India, and it is possible that Sri Lanka could play a similar role. Now there is a big there is a major issue going on in India about taxation of cryptocurrency ownership, and how gains and losses will be taxed. So there is potential for certain kind of exotic financial products, if I can call them, in Sri Lanka, which are targeting Indian investors, so that is again a possibility. On Prime Minister Wickremesinghe, you do know him much better than anybody else here. I mean, any of us here in Gateway House. But I think at this point of time, what other option does he have but to be the Narasimha Rao of Sri Lanka? And second, I think the time at which he took the job, it was pretty clear how bad the crisis has become and how much worse it is going to get before things start improving. So somewhere I think that link with reality is there, that yes, we are in a grave crisis and that somebody has to take on the heavy lifting. So I would feel much more optimistic about him than about his predecessor. That's all from my side, Rajiv.
Thank you very much, Amit. Very convincingly answered. My last question has to go to Madam Chitrangani as the head of the diplomatic service in Sri Lanka, and coming from a country which chaired BIMSTEC until March this year, the regional body for cooperation and integration in this region, and it's a body in which Sri Lanka has invested heavily politically and in other terms. And obviously, unless and until Sri Lankan economy regains health, Sri Lanka would be hard put to contribute to BIMSTEC. My question is it possible for Sri Lanka to go to BIMSTEC as well and see if some of the countries, for example Bangladesh, which is making rapid progress on the economic front, and Thailand, which remains a very successful economy in Southeast Asia, whether some assistance, some help can be secured beyond moral support for Sri Lanka?
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. Yeah, I think, as you said, we have been playing quite a role in BIMSTEC, and we were also, I think, the first chair of BIMSTEC. And also I was speaking about goodwill, where we enjoy goodwill with most of the countries, and of course within BIMSTEC. You spoke about Bangladesh, Thailand. Bangladesh, in fact, has also come in, of course, during the last few weeks to help us in certain way, because Bangladesh economy is also moving quite well. So Bangladesh has been in the picture, and we could, of course, depend on more aid and solidarity with Bangladesh and also Thailand. So while we work with countries bilaterally, I think, as it has been mentioned, we should also look at regional assistance from regional bodies and also multilateral. Even the UN has promised some aid. I saw a few days back. So we cannot be choosing, whom we can expect and who is prepared to help us. I think we should approach. And if I may just say a few words about what we were spoken about India. India has, and also Dr. Ganeshan was speaking about what India should do. India is not India 20, 30 years ago. It's a different country altogether. That is what I experienced also in 2017, 2018. So India, with this regional status, regional leadership status that is emerging, India could, because I mean, even as I spoke, the countries, when India takes a stand, very self-confident stand, even not considering the developed countries, say the USA. If you're talking about Quad, despite being a Quad member, India didn't vote with the Quad on the Russia-Ukraine issue. And also, it's very interesting to see the reaction of these countries. The US or Europe, initially they said, okay, we understand the position taken by India. So India has a big say and could be a very important partner for Sri Lanka, and India's rise is also very useful for Sri Lanka, and these are the areas that we could look at. So India could play a bigger role than before.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate that. And Manjeet, please give me 3 more minutes because my monopoly has just been compromised. We have a question from the chat box. And Dr. Ganeshan, this question has to come to you. It says, and this coming from Pamela Dean, we appreciate very much the assistance extended by India. However, there is a public concern that India is trying to take over strategic assets in the country. It is important for India to address these concerns without any delay. If not, there is a possibility of seeking support away from the region. My only comment is that this question does expand my knowledge about Sri Lanka, because this is the first time I'm hearing that India is trying to take away national assets of Sri Lanka. But over to you, Dr. Ganeshan, please respond.
So, I mean, this is a fascinating debate we are having because, we quietly gave China lots of our strategic assets without even thinking about it, with no feasibility studies, no planning, no discussion. It was just done. And, there were some good projects, but some really low return projects. And, I don't dismiss the entire Chinese portfolio. Some of the projects are essential for Sri Lanka to kind of get on with it. For instance, the power plant also, while I don't like coal power plants, without that, we wouldn't have any electricity today, given the way we've managed the electricity, as well as the port, as I mentioned, in Colombo port and the CICT terminal. But the Indian story, look, my sense of it is, look, there's this issue for sure of the oil tanks that they talk about. Now, I think that would have been an easy thing for us to have done under some agreement with India. And I think that had been promised, but the Sri Lankan side, to my knowledge, didn't really follow through properly with that. And I think that's a gap. The terminal in Colombo, Adani was trying to come. Okay, so here's the issue, I think, for Sri Lanka, that we are encouraging an Indian businessman, one big family, to come to Sri Lanka, right? And it would be more palatable if you encouraged a broader group of Indian investors to come. I think that may be one issue, because people worry about monopolies, right, and about dominant people, and I'm sure you worry about that everywhere. Whereas if a broader base group of Indian investors, for instance, unknown to us, perhaps publicly, the largest poultry farmer in India is in Sri Lanka. I met him the other day. He's from the south. and does an excellent job. I think he produces chickens for export to India, which I was like, wow, I never knew this, right? The TVS group from the south is in Sri Lanka and has been for many years. So I think we should encourage a broad-based investment from India, right? I think that's very important. So my sort of point is Sri Lanka in its current state needs investment from anywhere, right? And we have to tell Sri Lankan people that it can come from wherever it is, providing it's coming at a sort of a rules-based manner, which doesn't discriminate between local and foreign and follows certain standards that should come. And if Indian investment come, we should encourage it. And I think Indian investment and the link with India is very, very important. Because you see, what's not known in Sri Lanka is the Chinese have come, they built infrastructure. There's very little FDI from China in manufacturing, none. And that tells you how the Chinese have perceived Sri Lanka, right? They have not invested in manufacturing in this country, nor have they invested very much in services, but they've invested on 6% rates for infrastructure loans. The port city, though, is the exception where they've taken an investment risk. So my answer would be we have to be accepting of investment from wherever, and we have to explain that to Sri Lankans that we really are in a situation where we need FDI from everywhere to encourage our growth. That's what I would say.
That is a very good takeaway from this deep discussion. Investment from anywhere into Sri Lanka should be acceptable to Sri Lankans, naturally under acceptable terms and conditions. My last thought, India had two saviors in the hour of its need. P.V. Narasimha Rao, Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, Finance Minister. Prime Minister Ranil combines the two positions today, but he faces the same challenge. He would not have time, although he would have known both these personalities, but he would not have time these days to learn more about them. I think it is incumbent on Indian scholars and also perhaps Sri Lankan scholars to study that period and the contribution by these two legendary Indian leaders and see if there is some takeaway, some conclusion that might apply to the Sri Lankan situation. I offer this thought humbly, not in any fashion as the elder brother and much less as the big brother. Thank you, dear friends. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm now very happy to request Manjeet Karplani, our Executive Director, to make the concluding observations at this event. You are muted.
Thank you, Rajiv. You have actually, you and the panelists have done an excellent job, and the best outcome has been a positive outcome about the potential for Sri Lanka's turnaround and the potential investments for countries like India and others in this marvelous country that is to our south. I won't take anybody else's time, but we will have an outcome document from this discussion, and we'll be sure to send it out to all of you. We request you, especially our panelists, to give us your comments so that we can really put this out in the public realm and socialize some of these ideas publicly. We look forward to many more such discussions and with Geographical Cartographer. And thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All the best. Bye-bye. We are with you.
Thank you. It's been a wonderful session. Thank you.
Thank you.